During World War II, a primary target for the Allied bombing campaign was the ball bearing factories in Schweinfurt, Germany. After several earlier attempts to knock out the factories, a bomber group of 324 B-17s were given the dangerous mission. Since each B-17 carried 10 crew members, this single one-day mission required more than 3,200 men to fly into enemy territory. At the end of the day, the targets were destroyed. But on that day alone, more than 700 members of the bomber group were killed. Today, strategic bombers are still tasked to bring the fight to the enemy's heartland, but they bear little resemblance to their ancestors.
Its very existence may have been the most closely guarded secret of the atomic age. The rollout of the Northrop B-2 bomber in 1988 heralded more than just the arrival of 21st century technology. It announced an end to traditional bomber theory. The B-2 soars at the pinnacle of aviation research. But the advancements built into the B-2 were not included simply to make it the next bomber in a long line of bombers to join up in a giant formation. Stealth technology allows for one B-2 to replace an entire bomber group flying hundreds of outdated bombers. The aircraft's contours and surfaces absorb rather than reflect radar waves. When the tests and modifications are complete, the B-2 will have a radar signature more characteristic of a bird than of a bomber. This flying wing boasts digital electronic controls that eliminate the need for conventional rudders. Advanced engineering has also totally restructured the need for a vertical tail surface. Flying unnoticed into enemy airspace, one B-2 can accomplish a mission that once required risking an entire bomber group. The stealth bomber is the latest aerial dreadnought to take flight in the nearly century-long march of military aviation. Military strategists first dismissed the airplane as an expensive toy and a passing fad. But during World War I, aviation brought a new dimension to the strategy of war. Step by step, technology improved the capabilities of both fast fighter planes engaged in air-to-air duels and bomber aircraft dropping explosives on the enemy below.
Aerial bombing changed the way war was conducted in a number of ways. In one regard, it was nothing more than long-range artillery. In the other regard, the aerial reconnaissance was the step before the bombing. It provided the shooter a pretty good idea where his hits were landing. They were spotters, they were artillery spotters, and then someone thought, well, while we're over here, why not drop a few of our own weapons? And that essentially was how it began.
Two theories began to develop concerning bombing targets. One was strategic, the other tactical.
Strategic is generally beyond the battlefield area, and its intent is to do something to seriously affect the ability of the other side to wage war, striking at the industrial capability of the enemy. That's what strategic is. Tactical, on the other side, on the other hand, would be what happens around the battlefield in killing or in destroying soldiers and the enemy's armor, armament, artillery, ships, whatever, and its ability to conduct warfare.
For the first time, modern technology in the form of the airplane would allow soldiers to fly over battlefield adversaries and strike at targets previously considered unreachable. Early bombing raids utilized two distinct types of aircraft: giant rigid airships and early prototypes of what would soon become known as the heavy bomber. When they first went into action over Great Britain, the German Zeppelin raids had a great psychological terrorist effect on the civilian population. Zeppelins hid in the clouds and lured observers into position. When they spotted a target, the hydrogen-filled airships released their bombs.
Those were strictly terrorist kind of things. They were against population centers, and they were intended to lower the morale of the English populace.
As defenses against the raids improved, losses to the Zeppelin fleet became unacceptable.
Anything could take them on simply because they were so slow and cumbersome and couldn't maneuver. They couldn't outrun anyone, so they were sitting duck.
To continue the attacks, the Germans built airplanes that could carry a larger load of explosives to a target. Their most successful heavy bomber was the twin-engine Gotha G4, which saw action over British soil in June of 1917.
And then it became a little bit better because they could get lower, first of all. They were a little bit faster, so they were less vulnerable to ground fire, and they could get pretty close to an enemy gun emplacement, and this from an elevation of 100 feet, go ahead and drop this, and be pretty accurate.
The size of the bombs, their lethality, and their efficiency increased dramatically during the First World War. Initially, the bombs weighed between 50 to 100 pounds. But as the planes grew more powerful, bombs weighing 2,000 pounds could be carried into the air. Soon the Allies, under the command of American Colonel Billy Mitchell, were coordinating huge bombing raids. In the attack for Saint Mihiel, nearly 1,000 planes worked together to greatly multiply the effects of their bombs.
He had about 1,000 effective airplanes on the day of the battle, and he divided them so that he had 500 airplane brigades on either side of the Saint Mihiel salient, and systematically suppressed the German air and then systematically beat up the German ground troops as in a way that had never done before, and which really prophesied the future.
The concentrated use of a number of bomber aircraft flying and fighting as one gained enormous attention during World War I. Lessons learned during the First War of the Industrial Age shook the very foundations of traditional military strategies. A whole new way of looking at warfare was on the horizon.
Bomber Group will return in a moment here on A&E.
You like?
Had long-range bombers rendered other weapons like the battleship obsolete? Billy Mitchell, forever the aviation visionary, claimed that one of his modern bombers could annihilate a battleship.
The only way that Mitchell could get attention directed to this thing was following his own bent, which was to be flamboyant. And he made probably outrageous statements about the ascendancy of the airplane over the battleship.
Naval authorities scoffed in 1921 as Mitchell sent his Martin MB-2 bombers on an attack against the captured German battleship Ostfriesland. The demonstration ended in just 20 minutes as the once invincible dreadnought disappeared beneath the sea. 2 years later, Mitchell proved that it wasn't luck that sank the Ostfriesland. 2 more of Mitchell's bombers sank the retired U.S. battleships Virginia and New Jersey, right before the skeptical eyes of military leaders. Mitchell again made his point. But the success of his demonstrations did not settle the issue of what should be the most appropriate role and size of a heavy bomber force. In the 30s, the success of strategic bombing raids during the Spanish Civil War impressed Adolf Hitler. Lessons learned in Spain influenced him to make aviation a high priority in his rapidly expanding war machine.
It was Nazi Germany's kind of a trial balloon with this new concept in warfare that had not really gotten a great deal of support by the end of World War I.
The German bombers were among the first to be built entirely of metal. They were armored against anti-aircraft fire and outfitted with state-of-the-art radio communications and advanced bomb sights. At the outbreak of World War II, the Nazis rolled out a huge bomber fleet capable of destroying entire cities.
In many ways, the greatest employer of bombers of all times was Joseph Goebbels, the German propagandist, because he used a motley set of bombers to intimidate the world.
For a time, the Germans owned the skies over continental Europe. Often, Luftwaffe fighter planes delivered the first blow, and then the bombers arrived for the knockout punch. German aviation technology appeared almost unstoppable. It wasn't until the Luftwaffe set its sights on Great Britain that weaknesses in its invincible mantle began to appear, especially in its bombing practices. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring's orders from Hitler were to deliver an aerial knockout of the RAF before German naval and land forces could begin the invasion of England, Operation Sea Lion. Hitler rightly reasoned that the only chance of success for his invasion was to kill the RAF before the ground invasion could take place. The aerial battle of Britain became the first major disaster for German air power. The Germans found that the lessons they had learned from the Spanish Civil War were not applicable in this attack on Britain.
They drew all the wrong inferences from Spain. They did so well in their ground attack in Spain, and their bombers did so well against the sort of ragtag loyalist defenses, that they assumed that their medium bomber fleet would be adequate for continental targets. And if you think about it, the distance between Berlin and Prague or Berlin and Vienna, it probably seemed reasonable. But as soon as they came up against the British and the English Channel, their medium bomber fleet was no longer acceptable, and they didn't have time to create a strategic fleet.
The RAF, in its finest hour, was more than a match for the Luftwaffe. British heroism, combined with an incredibly effective ring of radar surrounding the island, stopped the Nazi onslaught. The German defeat remains an example of how not to conduct a long-range bombing offensive. It was found that Hitler had made a fatal error by not stressing the production of 4-engine bombers. The twin-engine aircraft had served him well on the continent, but their limited flying range in the battle for the skies over Britain meant that only the southern part of England could be effectively attacked.
A twin-engine bomber, if it loses an engine, let's say, for any reason, operational or combat, it's lost 50% of its power, and its only recourse is to jettison all of its weapons and go home. A 4-engine bomber, if it loses an engine, it has the option of feathering the prop and continuing on the mission, but still taking the bomb load because it's only lost 25% of its power, and then coming home.
The twin-engine, slow-flying German bombers were easy prey for the much faster and more maneuverable British Spitfire and Hurricane fighters. Hitler's Air Force had never gone up against such formidable planes. As a result, the armadas of German bombers had to be protected by Luftwaffe fighters, spreading thin the entire German Air Force. The German battle planners became unfocused. Daylight raids in August and September were directed at too many targets: radar installations, fighter airfields, bomber airfields, factories, even civilian targets. The net result was that the Luftwaffe didn't do a complete job of destroying any of their targets. With each futile attempt and a growing casualty list, Hermann Göring switched his strategy to night bombing, but this too had its drawbacks. Pinpoint accuracy at night was hard to achieve, so the Nazis aimed their bombing raids at breaking the spirit of the people.
Hitler decided that he should adopt the terrorist subset of strategic warfare and just bomb population centers. He was convinced that he could ruin the morale of the Brits and drive them to their knees.
The Blitz of London and other night attacks on British towns and cities set England on fire. 30,000 civilians died, 3.5 million were made homeless, but the British wouldn't be cowed. By the spring of 1941, Hitler saw that strategic bombing, at least in this form, would not bring his hoped-for victory against England.
Bomber Group will return in a moment here on A&E.
Japanese aircraft carrier supported by a large force of warships sailing 200 miles off the island of Oahu. 2 task forces were launched that consisted of 353 aircraft. If ever there was a question about the destructive power of aerial bombing, this raid answered it. Meeting with little effective resistance, the Japanese destroyed 311 American aircraft, sank 2 battleships, and immobilized another 2. But in many ways, the attack on Pearl Harbor backfired. It was a perfect tactical bombing raid, but strategically, the bombing failed. The Japanese had struck at United States military might, but failed to affect her industrial capabilities, or more importantly, American morale. Instead, the attack mobilized American forces and industry to a degree the enemy could never have foreseen. It also united the American people behind the war effort. Like the citizens of London, the Americans wouldn't be intimidated. Instead, they demanded swift retaliatory action against the Japanese. A gesture of resolve, courage, and daring was needed. It was finally decided that a bombing raid on Tokyo launched from carriers was the only feasible option because no Allied airfields were within range of the Japanese homeland. Such a gesture, it was believed, would show the Japanese people that their island was not invincible and safe from attack.
All these Rosie the Riveters who were cranking out all these airplanes and working overtime and doing this marvelous, miraculous job they needed a boost, and the Doolittle raid was exactly that. It was a stroke of genius.
The bomber selected for this mission was the twin-engine B-25 Mitchell. The officer put in charge of the raid was Lieutenant Colonel James Jimmy Doolittle.
It caused the Japanese to question their warlord. And from a tactical point of view, it caused the retention of aircraft in Japan for the defense of the home islands when we had no intention of hitting them again seriously in the near future.
The planning put into the operation was enormous. On the East Coast, the USS Hornet was selected as the launch carrier. Several B-25 takeoffs were rehearsed off the Hornet's deck in order to learn what modifications would be needed to the bomber. It was decided to take the rear gun turret out and equip the planes with additional fuel tanks. The bombers were modified to drop 3 500-pound bombs plus clusters of small incendiary weapons. Volunteering for the mission were 24 crews of the 17th Bombardment Group. The mission was so secret that the men were not told what their target would be. At a secret airstrip in Florida, the crews began training for taking off from the carrier deck in the modified B-25s. The takeoffs had to be accomplished within 300 feet with a full load of bombs. These short field takeoffs were something new for bomber crews.
It was quite a sensation because when you haul back at full flaps and full throttles, when that plane is airborne for about 30 seconds, the only thing that's keeping you in the air or keeping you airborne is the torque of the propellers, and then it gradually picks up a little speed and you do get your flying speed. It's quite a sensation.
Once these rehearsals were completed, the planes were flown at low altitude all the way across the country.
We were authorized to hedge up all the way to Alameda, which was quite unusual. That was definitely necessary because we were practicing low-level attacks, and that was part of the raid going into Japan.
In San Francisco, Doolittle and his men were greeted by the Hornet, which had steamed to the Pacific while the bombing mission was being put together on the East Coast. The B-25s were immediately loaded onto the ship. Once they were all secured, the Hornet cast off and sailed for enemy waters. Out at sea, the top-secret target was finally revealed to the men who greeted the assignment with enormous enthusiasm.
We were definitely gung-ho, and we wanted to get the damn job done, especially after it had been announced that it was the Japanese mainland.
On April 13th, 11 days after leaving port, they were joined by Task Force 16 under the command of Admiral William Halsey. Together, they pushed forward towards Japan. The plan was to launch the bombers 450 miles west of Japan. After dropping their bombs, the planes would overfly to the safety of China. En route, the crew continued physical training and learned rudimentary Japanese in case they had to bail out and were captured. They were also briefed on major targets in Tokyo, including locations of anti-aircraft batteries, government buildings, radio towers, and the Imperial Palace, which they chose to avoid. Most of the pilots were far more worried about the B-25's ability to take off from the Hornet than they were about the actual bombing raid. One constant worry was that of being spotted by Japanese reconnaissance aircraft and ships. It was decided that if they were in range of Japan, nothing would stop them from carrying out the mission, even if it meant they could fall into enemy hands once the bombs were dropped.
That was the worst thing we could think of. And if we were not in range of Tokyo, we would go back to Midway. If we were not in range of either Tokyo or Midway, we would permit our airplanes to be pushed overboard so the decks could be cleared for the use of the carrier Hornet's own aircraft.
Once in Japanese waters, the aircraft were fueled and the bombs were loaded. The mission was right on course. But on April 18th, things went sour. A Japanese fishing boat was spotted. Fearing that it was a reconnaissance vessel and that it had radioed word of the Hornet's position back to Japan, the two cruisers accompanying the carrier opened fire and sank it. Rather than scuttle the mission, Doolittle decided to prepare for immediate takeoff. The Hornet was 823 miles from Tokyo, and it was some 10 hours before the planned takeoff time. Worse yet, a 40-mile-an-hour gale churned the seas and the Hornet pitched wildly. Yet the decks were cleared and the planes were manned. Colonel Doolittle's was the first plane off for Japan.
Well, the morning of the takeoff, the weather was rough. It was white caps, and we took off from midsection of the carrier, which a lot of people don't realize. The B-25 could not make a running start at it because they only had a 10-foot clearance between the wingtip and the island. So each plane had to taxi out midsection of the carrier. We took off with full throttles and full flaps.
There were two near casualties during this crucial takeoff phase. One plane was thrown up in the air during takeoff because of the carrier's wildly pitching deck. The pilot just barely regained control after taking flight. Another pilot put his flaps down and, when he put the flap control back in neutral, accidentally set them all the way back up. So he took off with no help from his flaps. The plane headed for the water, dragged its tail, and then miraculously headed skyward. In all, 80 men and 16 airplanes sped westwards toward the enemy. The plans had completely changed. Originally, the raid was to have taken place under a cloak of darkness. Now, it would be executed in broad daylight. But fate and luck were with Doolittle and his men. At the exact moment they entered enemy airspace, the Japanese were in the middle of an enormous civil defense drill. This allowed the American planes to slip in without alarming the Japanese radar operators, who were caught off guard. Evidently, the Japanese fishing boat had not radioed Tokyo about the existence of the American task force.
The key, I think, to that raid being successful was surprise. That was probably the best cover and deception operation of the whole war.
The B-25s approached their targets right over the treetops, pulled up to 2,200 feet, and dropped their bombs.
Dropping the bombs was no problem because at 2,200 feet, it's just like laying an egg in a rain barrel. We could feel the explosion in the back end of the plane. It flipped the tail up a little bit because we were so low. And then being a 1,000-pound explosion on the bombs, it tipped the plane pretty good.
Doolittle's raiders accomplished their mission. their bombs sending a message to the Japanese about American determination. Due to the extreme range from which the bombers were launched, the crews struggled to make it to the safety of their predetermined airfields in China. Low on fuel, several crews bailed out and lived. Others crashed off the China coast. The Japanese captured others. Doolittle and his men became instant American heroes. Their courageous strategic bombing mission had delivered the shot in the arm the United States was looking for.
The effect on the Japanese people was enormous, but more importantly, the effect on the American people was even better, even greater, even more effective.
Bomber Group will return in a moment here on A&E.
In Europe, Allied forces began mass bombing raids on targets in Nazi Germany. Ironically, they initially made many of the same mistakes the Germans had made when they lost the Battle of Britain. Two-engine bombers like the Douglas Boston had neither the range nor the altitude to contend with German anti-aircraft fire, nor the speed to avoid the fast and highly maneuverable German fighters like the Messerschmitts. The immediate need for a four-engine bomber was obvious.
The development of the four-engine bomber stems from that need to produce a strategic bomber. In other words, a weapon that could carry bombs a long distance and raid not just military targets, which basically fighter aircraft were capable of doing, attacking the trenches of enemy troop formations, but to be able to attack industrial centers, to be able to attack population centers around the world. That's really why the four-engine bomber was developed.
Bombing accuracy in the air war over Germany was abysmal. Only 1 in 5 bombers got within 5 miles of their targets, and then only 1 bomb in 12 hit its mark. Far from delivering a knockout blow to Germany, Allied bombing campaigns, both tactical and strategic, were military failures. But results began to improve when the British introduced the four-engine Avro Lancaster.
It was perhaps the classic European four-engine bomber. It had the capability of taking the payload, it had the range, it had the defensive armament, and it's one of those aircraft that if you talk to pilots of that era, everyone wanted to fly because it had the power. It was even a bomber that was capable of being looped. It was a remarkable design.
When the Americans entered the war, they brought with them the most advanced four-engine bombers in the world. The Boeing B-17 was something new. Like its name implies, this bomber was a flying fortress.
The reporter on the scene says it looks like a flying fortress, and that name stuck with it, and that name popularized it, so that it was today still most famous and the most beloved of bombers of the war. Crews loved it, the Germans hated to attack it, the Japanese hated to attack it because it had a fearsome firepower.
It was faster, it could go higher, could carry more bombs, and those were all important factors. But the biggest single thing was its defensive firepower.
Similar in size, yet with even greater speed, range, and payload, was the B-24. The Liberator was a plane of incredible endurance, stamina, and reputation. By the war's end, 19,256 B-24s came off American assembly lines, more than any other military aircraft of World War II. The arrival of the American bombers brought a high profile to the air war over Germany.
They really were the thing which the American public focused upon as the vehicle for carrying the war to the enemy. Even though the battles on the ground were probably far more important, they were not as visible and was not getting nearly the coverage that the bombing raids were getting.
Prime strategic targets in the heart of Hitler's war machine included ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt. In theory, the destruction of these factories would literally bring the German war effort to a halt. The Germans were very careful to make these factories difficult to spot from the air, going to elaborate efforts to camouflage their existence. Located deep in enemy territory, The bombing runs to these targets proved to be hellish assignments for the crews.
Did I ever think I was going to die? Every mission I went on, I was just hoping that I'd see the sunset again. In the morning when you go to briefing, you'd figure out maybe there's going to be 10 airplanes shot down, and you'd look around the room and see, I wonder what poor son of a gun isn't going to make it today. You never thought it was going to be you, and you kept that in your mind. When you got at the end of the runway to take off, that's when it really set in.
The handling of fear was a big part of the assignment.
It was just embedded in us. We were never turned back from a target. You'd never chicken out. When you're flying a formation with another airplane and flak's blowing in between you and him and you're 35 feet apart, that's getting close. So you worry about it. As far as flak, that was the worst thing we had to combat. That did more damage than fighters. And flak, you couldn't shoot it. You just had to go through it. And never did we go on a mission that we did not get hit. Flak would blow airplanes completely up when the bomb doors were open on a bomb run, and a direct hit would hit that bomb bay and just blow the whole airplane. You wouldn't see anything, just a big ball of fire, and that's all there was. And it's just boom, boom. You can hear them going off, you can see them going off. But again, if you can hear and see it, it won't hurt you. It's the one you don't see and the one you don't hear that's going to get you.
Raids such as these were lethal. In one day alone, during the bombing of Schweinfurt, 60 aircraft carrying 600 men went down. Flying in these cumbersome armadas of planes sometimes made the crews feel like sitting ducks.
And when you see airplanes that you've got your buddies in it, and you see them blow up in front of you, that's a sad thing too. But then you got another thought, that was him and it wasn't you. So that's another side of the sun. I think everybody has a little of that in him. He's not ashamed to say so either.
Not only did the crews fight the enemy, they also struggled against the elements.
No one, I don't think anyone can imagine exactly how horrible the conditions were in the back of a B-24 or a B-17. You know, temperatures up there were 30, 40 degrees below zero. And when you see these people in their sheepskin coats and heavy gloves and realizing that they're sitting in circumstances like that for 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours at a time, it's unbelievable.
When do you become a man? It depends on what circumstance there are. So kids at that time automatically were in the service like myself, and we became a man. I was one of the youngest ones there. I was just 21 when I flew combat. But the oldest man in our squadron, we called him Pappy Kruger because he was 27 years old.
The planes themselves matched the mettle of the men, proving incredibly resilient.
They took a lot of beating. A lot of them came limping home on less than 4 engines and all shot up, and a lot of their crew hurt and wounded. And the ability of those airplanes to absorb punishment was pretty impressive.
The bombing raids sometimes continued 24 hours a day. The difference between a day drop and a night drop was often a trade-off between accuracy and safety. The Americans usually took the day runs, with the British taking the night shift.
The accuracy of bombing was much better in daylight than it was at night. The British put a lot of airplanes up, and they destroyed a lot of factories. But when it comes to pinpoint accuracy, our bombing was a lot better than theirs. Daylight bombing was much more dangerous, and that's why the British went. They had no fighters at the time when they started daylight bombing, so they got shot down, so they went to night so the German fighters couldn't shoot them down.
One advance that improved the safety of daylight bombing was the box system of flight formation. Developed by Colonel Curtis LeMay, his theory involved huge armadas of bombers flying in a staggered formation.
If you're one airplane over a heavily defended target in Europe, you're the target of every piece of equipment that's able to shoot something at you. If you're one of 100 guys, then your survivability has gone up by a factor of 100.
Planes were staggered so that they could fire back at enemy aircraft without hitting the other bombers in the formation.
The staggering of the airplanes exactly was put that way so the gunners would not shoot each other, and they had a field of range all the way around them. Most guns could be fired in almost any direction without it hitting anything other than the enemy.
Another innovative breakthrough was the Norden bomb sight, which performed marvels of precision, bombing from 25,000 feet. For the first time, it allowed the bombardier to dial into his equation a number of variables that could help get the bombs on target.
Things like temperature, side slip angle, G, sometimes gust loads would affect the bombers, and that would affect the fall of the weapon. Certainly wind. All of these things are variables.
The bomb sight's makeup was a well-kept secret.
It was so secret that in training, my bombardier and I would have to wear 45s, and we'd go to a compound and pick the bomb sight up, take it under wrap to the airplane, which had a cover over the nose, and put it in the nose, and then we could fly. But the rest of the crew never saw the bomb sight except the navigator.
Bomber crew duty bred fear, bravery, and superstition.
We had a fellow in our squadron that got called his first mission and he overslept, so he jumped into his flight clothes with his pajamas on. And he got back from his first mission. And after that time, he would never go on a mission without wearing his pajamas. And we tried to get him to stop, because if he ever bailed out, then he'd be walking across Germany in pajamas instead of a uniform.
Dropping bombs on civilian populations raised difficult moral questions.
They were at war against us. All the efforts that those civilians down there were doing, even if they did nothing more than make a sandwich for the husband to go to the factory to make a bomb, they were doing something to try to kill me. And my object was to kill them before they killed me, and it's that simple. Anybody that fights against the United States is my enemy, whoever it might be, then, now, or in the future.
When you're being shot at by very effective artillery, and when you're being shot at by the finest fighters in the world, and your buddies are dropping like flies all around you, the sense of concern over who's being affected on the ground by your bomb kind of pales to insignificance.
Come on, you guys, get out of that plane. Bail out.
By the time the war ended in Europe, no one could dispute the overall contribution of the bomber crews to the Allied victory. British and American fatalities alone amounted to nearly 100,000 men.
I would say bombing over Germany in World War II was about as hard a thing as you can ask an aviator to do, even to this day.
Bomber Group will return in a moment here on A&E. We now return to Bomber Group.
Ever since the attack on Pearl Harbor, America had prepared for a full military offensive against Japan. Massive bombardment was the cornerstone of the plan. If the air offensive was successful, a land offensive might not be necessary. Key to the plan was the ultimate air weapon of World War II, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. B-29 engineers and designers were ordered to make them the biggest, gun them the heaviest, and make them fly the furthest. Initial raids proved unproductive. Although the B-29 was state-of-the-art, the initial plan of dropping bombs from the safe altitude of nearly 6 miles above the target proved impossible. Even with advanced bomb sights, the incredible distance the bombs had to fall created too many variables that led to too many missed targets. Major General Curtis LeMay ordered a complete change in tactics when he initiated low-level B-29 incendiary attacks on Tokyo at night. The ancient city's wood structures burst like kindling in the inferno.
We burned out 16.8 square miles of Tokyo by using incendiary bombs totally. And the city's structure, of course, was wood and paper and very fragile. And it began the beginning of the end for Japan.
Weighing the loss of an estimated 1 million Allied soldiers in a land invasion of Japan, President Truman decided to drop the atomic bomb. The B-29 was chosen to deliver this weapon that would change warfare forever. On August 6, 1945, the atom bomb leveled Hiroshima. This one bomb had the equivalent destructive power of 1,000 B-29s fully loaded with conventional explosives. Nuclear weapons had become the ace card in the strategic bomber's deck.
It hadn't been possible with conventional bombs. It simply didn't work. The enemy was too tough. The structures took the punishment. But with the advent of the atom bomb, a single airplane was able to make a decision that not only did tremendous devastation, but for the first time truly broke morale. The atom bomb gave the Japanese a face-saving way out of the war that they couldn't have imagined otherwise.
Following World War II and aviation's entry into the jet age, one aircraft stands above all others as the workhorse of both strategic and tactical bombers, the B-52 Stratofortress. This dreadnought of the sky has now served in updated versions for nearly 40 years, through Vietnam and most recently, Desert Storm.
Its speed and its load-carrying capabilities were enormous, and I think that's why it was so good. It was built in great numbers, and many of the folks who are flying the B-52 right now are flying airplanes that were built before they were born.
But the very fact that no proper replacement for the B-52 has been found in over 4 decades questions the need for large formations of heavy bombers. Also, the success of new weapons that drove the coalition forces to victory in Desert Storm has put the huge super bombers at a crossroads.
The Persian Gulf War taught the American people that precision weapons and standoff weapons delivered from stealthy airplanes is clearly the way to go.
One standout aircraft is the FB-111. Not quite a bomber and not quite a fighter, the F-111 is a hybrid plane capable of multiple duties. Its performance in Desert Storm rewrote much of the book on bombing. Unlike bombers that depended on strength in numbers and that had to carpet their targets with explosives, the FB-111's strength is pinpoint accuracy.
And what does this mean? It means that you don't need big bombers anymore. You don't need B-52s that can carry hundreds of bombs anymore. What you need is the ability to surgically take out a very highly defended, heavily armored, small target. And so the F-111, relatively small, is probably the wave of the future.
If mid-range bombers are the wave of the future, where does this leave the huge super bombers like the B-1 and the B-2 now in development? Will these giants have any role in the arsenals of the future?
There will always be a need for the bomber with the ability for recall, for the ability to take out special targets, for the ability to engage in certain specialized wars. There are some situations in which the use of an intercontinental ballistic missile would be regarded as totally unacceptable for a whole variety of reasons, where a surgical bombing strike flown by pilots that know exactly what they're doing and are able to use their weapons effectively will still be a requirement.
CIA, espionage, assassinations, coups d'etats. What goes on behind closed doors in Langley, Virginia? Now you can find out. Call 1-800-423-1212, and for only $59.95 plus $5.95 shipping and handling, you can own this special 4-part deluxe boxed video cassette package, CIA, The Secret Files, an inside look at one of the most powerful and mysterious organizations in the world.
Tomorrow, does the media perpetuate violence?
Bill Curtis examines our country's killing culture on investigative reports.
Now, Nurses star Jeff Altman leads the laughs on A&E's An Evening at the Improv. Next.